The Articles of Confederation, as I've said before, were the precursors to the Constitution. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about how those were set up and why we don't have the Articles of Confederation anymore. So this was understood as a true confederation, a compact between 13 sovereign states. So the 13 colonies were each then understood to be sovereign independent units under the Articles of Confederation. So take a step and think about, what does a confederation really mean? Well, this is a loose association of independent states, meaning that each state was really essentially responsible for itself. They were merely agreeing to cooperate on a few key points, and emphasis here really on few. So what were those few points? The first thing was that it set up a Congress much like the Continental Congresses that had drafted the Declaration of Independence, that had originally organized the war effort. Every state had an equal say in this Congress, so it didn't matter whether your state had a very small population or a huge population. It didn't matter how big or small the state was. Everyone has the same say in this Congress. Also, every state retained its individual sovereignty. So that meant that all the decisions about the laws and policies that govern your territory were independent from that of any other. So it didn't really matter what the people in Pennsylvania decided the rules would be for the people in Massachusetts or in Rhode Island. Now, in order for there to be changes in laws that did cover all of the states, it required 9 of 13 to pass. That doesn't necessarily sound like a very high threshold, but keep in mind that at this point in time, you have a pretty significant landmass or territory to cover, and in order to convene the Congress, you can't just jump on Skype and say, oh, this is how I want to vote, nor is there a car or even a train that could get you from Georgia up to Philadelphia. Instead, everyone's going basically by horse and buggy. And that's going to take a great deal of time. So convening all 13 representatives in one place, pretty challenging. Again, this individual sovereignty was really important to the founders who wrote the Articles of Confederation. They really wanted to locus power in the states as the units closer to the people. They also didn't want the influence of southern states on northern states or vice versa. There's really already some pretty strong divisions between what states in the northern region of the country wanted versus the southern region. So this sounds not terrible, right? We don't necessarily want the policies of Louisiana to automatically be the policies in Wyoming or vice versa. So why didn't the Articles of Confederation work? Well, I hinted at it a little bit when I talked about the 9 of 13 to pass thing. But there are a few other things. One, there was no power to tax, and the states had just finished fighting a war. Wars are expensive. They've always been expensive. They will always be expensive. Think about all the reports you hear about how much the war in Iraq costs the United States, or the war in Afghanistan, or how much it will cost if we decide to go to Syria or Yemen or anywhere else. So we have this huge debt that is money we borrowed from countries like France, and they're not just going to say, keep it, it's fine. They want their money back, but we have no power to tax collectively, and if you're not being taxed, which state is going to sign up and say, oh yeah, we'll cover that? Not going to happen. The Articles of Confederation also had a Congress, but it had no leader. So there was no one to be in charge, to even just call to convene the Congress. There's also no power to regulate commerce. Well, why is that even important? Regulating commerce includes setting the rules for things like trade and currency. So at this point in time, if you wanted to travel from, say, New York to Virginia, you would have to travel through several states, and every single state would have its own currency. which means if you need to get a place to stay or stop and get something to eat in Maryland, you got to figure out where can you change your money out, or you just got to bring a lot of things to barter with. There's just no regulation of commerce, which makes travel that much more difficult, and it makes exchanging goods across land super challenging. Changes to those articles didn't just require the 9 of 13. That's to pass new laws. To actually change the Articles of Confederation to say add a power to tax or add a leader required a unanimous decision. So if 9 of 13 is difficult, 13 of 13 is pretty impossible. Now, did they just realize this on their own? No. It was Shays' Rebellion that really brought into relief just how problematic the way the Articles were set up was. Shays' Rebellion was started by farmers who were really just thoroughly upset about the level of debt that they were under and the demands that the Massachusetts government was placing on them to pay this debt back. So they felt that given the service that they had done to their country in the Revolution, as well as the importance of their very occupation, being farmers, and the need to feed the population, they felt they deserved debt relief. And when the Massachusetts government didn't want to provide that, they let a man named Shays led a group of these so-called regulators in taking over the Springfield Armory. Now, once this happened, some pretty stark realizations came about. One is that there was no set policy for whether or not other states should help, and Massachusetts didn't know how to handle this necessarily by themselves. Two was that there was no idea of who should pay to stop a rebellion that could have very easily turned into another revolution. This is when the continent, essentially the same parties who were in the Continental Congress, converge again and start thinking about drafting a constitution. And this time they come up with a few different plans that get debated, and the process is highly contentious because they're adding a great deal more beyond what the Articles of Confederation had. So let's talk about them in turn. First, the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan looks like our current government in that it has 3 branches of government, and the 3 branches we would recognize. A legislative branch, but it was a little bit different because the legislative branch in the New Jersey Plan was unicameral, meaning it only had one house. Unlike our current legislature, Congress, which has a House and a Senate, the legislature under the New Jersey Plan would just have one house. It would be like the Articles of Confederation and our current Senate in that every state would have the exact same representation. This made sense because New Jersey was a smaller state at the time and had concerns that if we did representation based on population, their ability to have a say in government would decline greatly. Next branch of government, the executive. A little bit different from our current executive. Under the New Jersey Plan, the executive would be appointed by the legislature. So every state would have equal representation in this legislature, and the legislature would then go on to appoint whomever would be the executive. And keep in mind, at this point, they don't necessarily have the name president. They're still throwing stuff around, everything from high exalted leader to his royal something something. All these crazy names are being thrown out there. Also, like our current government, we had a judicial branch under the New Jersey Plan. Now, this is starting to become a stair step, right? So the legislature is elected by the population, and they appoint the executive, who then in turn appoints the judicial. So in this plan, where is the power really? All right, now, Virginia Plan. Just like the New Jersey Plan and our current government, we've got 3 branches of government. Just like before, legislative. Difference, though, is that under the Virginia Plan, the legislative branch is bicameral, so a little bit more like what we have today. One house would be chosen by the people, so election, and the other house would be chosen by the state legislature. So keep in mind that none of these plans are specifying or changing the governments that the individual states have. They're drafting a plan for what the government that governs all the states should look like above or layered on top of the existing state governments. So under the Virginia plan, there would be two legislative houses, one chosen directly by the people, but the other chosen by the state legislatures. And we can see this as incorporating a little bit of Madison's ideas that maybe we need some Republican virtue governing our national legislature. What's markedly different from the New Jersey plan is that both of these houses would have representation for each state based in proportion to the citizen population. So the fewer people in your state, the fewer representatives you have in the legislative bodies of the National Congress. So this again is a little bit different than what we have today, right? We have a house that is based on citizen population. We also have the Senate, which is equal representation. A little bit more about the Virginia plan. The executive is elected by the legislature, so pretty similar to the New Jersey's appointment by the legislature. What the Virginia plan adds are some limitations on the executive. They wanted to specify that a person could only serve one term in order to try to avoid consolidations of power. The Virginia plan also has a judiciary because the idea of having separate branches and checks and balances was pretty agreed upon. The finer minutia of how those checks and balances should work, less so. But the idea that there should be three separate branches was pretty well agreed upon. Now, the judiciary under the Virginia plan would include at least one, but possibly more Supreme Courts, and judges would be appointed for life by the legislature. Who appoints judges now under our current system? One other thing the Virginia plan had that we didn't see in the New Jersey plan is this idea of legislative review. So while the legislature gets to appoint the executive, there is this process of legislative review where the executive and the judges appointed by the legislature could then review laws passed by the legislative body. Now, there were reasons why this didn't work well, neither of these plans, for everyone. Small states were in favor of the New Jersey plan, where it would give them a little bit more say in the national political arena, where large states felt like that undercut their value and their plans. There were differing ideas of just how much power should be locused in the executive body and whether or not the legislative body should have complete control over the other branches. Step in the Connecticut plan, also sometimes known as the Great Compromise. Right? This is composed by two of the members of the Continental Congress. It's not necessarily being called the Continental Congress right now. Just note that. Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth write the Great Compromise. They keep some things from both of the other plans that seem to be non-contentious. So, for example, 3 branches. Both plans had 3 branches. Everybody liked that. That was one of the problems in the Articles of Confederation. Say, all right, we'll keep it. And they keep it pretty much the same, a legislative branch. Now, they borrow elements from both the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. From the Virginia plan, it is bicameral, so there are 2 houses. But in a compromise, they decide that one house would be proportional, like the Virginia plan had, and the other would have equal representation, like the New Jersey plan. This is also where we get the 3/5 compromise, which is arguably one of the saddest and most telling in terms of poor ethical decisions portion of our Constitution. In fact, so problematic that in a reading of the Constitution in Congress, they chose to skip reading the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise, just to refresh, is where they decided that for the purposes of representation, slaves would count as 3/5 of a person, despite the fact that they would have 0 right to vote, which meant states like Virginia could utilize their slave population in order to acquire greater representation at the national level. In that same compromise, we get the executive, which is now known as the president, and it's elected not by the legislature that is elected by the specifications in the Great Compromise, but is also not elected directly by the people. The Great Compromise is what gets us to the Electoral College. The Great Compromise also splits the setup of the judiciary. So where the New Jersey plan had the judiciary appointed by the executive and the Virginia plan had it appointed by the legislature, the compromise says, okay, the executive will appoint the judiciary, but will have to get approval from the Senate. Now, these were not the only things that required compromise. We also had contention between groups known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So who were the Federalists and what did they want? Well, the Federalists thought that the Constitution sufficiently limited the national government. They felt that the Constitution protected the idea of a federal system, one in which states have sufficient sovereign power, but there is a national superseding government. They also didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary. They considered that the purview of the states, that the Constitution as it was written clearly didn't delineate that a national government had the right to interfere with individual citizens in the way that Anti-Federalists were concerned it would. So, Anti-Federalists. They feared the Constitution gave the national government too much power, that more power needed to be explicitly in the hands of the individual states. The Anti-Federalists are really looking for the Constitution to maintain some of that Confederation aspect that we saw in the Articles of Confederation. Now, unlike the Federalists, the reasons for this varied widely, from states that were concerned about the slavery question to those who just feared large, strong national government in general. Now, ultimately, these things have to be worked out, and this is largely done through the Federalist Papers, which were written by a wide variety of people and all submitted under pen name, pseudonyms, or anonymous, but we now know that many of them were composed by Alexander Hamilton, by Madison, and we can now look back and see how those Federalist Papers, which were advocating for the Federalist viewpoint, how those then shaped the development of the Constitution by publishing these concepts in public newspapers and entering it into the public forum. And it's really the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate that establishes how important a free media is in this country very early on. So, let's talk a little bit about the Constitution we ultimately end up with. We can break it down into 4 parts. The preamble, which has no force of law but establishes what the Constitution is going to do. You can kind of think of this like the introduction that you write to a paper. The articles themselves, this is what lays out the structure of the government. This is where we see the evidence of the Great Compromise in action. And then we have the Bill of Rights and the additional amendments. The Bill of Rights being the first 10 amendments that were passed almost immediately after the Constitution as part of a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And then, of course, all the amendments that have come thereafter. So, a little bit about the preamble. The preamble doesn't have any force of law, but it does tell us why the Constitution was created. And so, in doing so, it helps judges interpret what comes after the preamble. But nothing in the preamble itself constitutes an act of law. Now, it does, however, say what our goals are. Our goals being to ensure a just government, so an emphasis on justice, fairness right from the beginning, that citizens should be protected by their government, and that we're clearly trying to improve upon the Articles of Confederation. It was very important that in our preamble we specify this isn't adding to the Articles, but is replacing them. So what do the Articles themselves do? Well, the first 3 are the ones that establish our branches of government. Each article aligns with a different branch and spells out all the rules for who can serve in positions within that branch of government, what powers that branch has, and some finer details. We'll talk about those in more detail shortly. But what it importantly spells out is the relationship between the branches. So we can see this is a visualization of that checks and balances system. How do the powers of the different branches balance with each other in order to make sure that no one branch can control everything? So you can take a minute to look at sort of the arrows being how power moves from one branch to another. After the first three branches, we get Article 4. And this is really important, the full faith and credit provision. This links that idea of confederation, but also helps with that commerce problem that I mentioned under the Articles of Confederation. It says that states will recognize each other's laws. So if I get married in Massachusetts, it still counts in Louisiana, for example. Or my driver's license in Louisiana allows me to drive through Texas if I need to. This is part of that citizen privileges and duties from other states. That just because I leave Louisiana doesn't mean I suddenly have questionable citizenship. I don't need a passport to go to Illinois. I can just go there. Driver's license is helpful, but my citizenship in one state carries over to citizenship in other states. Article 4 also spells out the rules for acquiring territories and creating new states. Importantly, it says that you can't divide up a state into new states. So we can't just partition New Orleans from the rest of Louisiana and say, well, New Orleans wants to be its own state. We have to maintain a solid statehood. Once a state is created, those will be its boundaries. There's one exception to this. Any guesses which state can be subdivided? Send me an email with the name of the state that can indeed be subdivided into new states for 2 extra credit points. Article 5. This is really important as well. Remember, one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation was that the process for amending the Articles was really too rigorous. It just couldn't happen. So Article 5 spells out how the Constitution can be amended. And there are 2 starting points, 2 ratification possibilities. So amendments can be proposed by either 2/3 of both houses of Congress, so 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate, or by a national convention called by Congress on the request of 2/3 of the states. So 2/3 of all the states say we vote in favor of a national convention, and then the amendment can be proposed. Now, once it's proposed, ratification requires the approval of the state legislatures of 3/4 of the states or by ratifying conventions. So all the states can either put it towards the state legislators or can put it up for a vote on a statewide ballot. Article 6. This was very important in light of the failures of the Articles of Confederation. The recognition of government debt. We noted that, 1, the debt from the Revolution belonged to all the states, not any one particular state, and that the states collectively would collect taxes to pay back this debt. It also established the supremacy of national law. Well, what does that mean? It means that the states still retain power to pass laws that govern within their jurisdiction, but that laws passed at the national level supersede or are more important and can overrule those laws passed at the state level. Article 6 spells out the constitutional oath, who has to take it, and specifically make sure that the constitutional oath does not require any sort of religious affiliation. Related to that, it prohibits religious tests. So while the reasons for the revolution were more economic than religious, the ideas of religious freedom that were part of what prompted many of the original immigrants, colonists from England, were still present. And the idea of a state religion was still very scary to these early U.S. citizens. Article 7 is perhaps the most straightforward of them all because it's official adoption of the Constitution. All right, we're going to stop there for a minute.